Hi everyone. So today we move on to the next key knowledge points in Unit 3, Outcome 3, Operations Management. We look at the key elements of an operations system, look at the inputs, the processes and outputs, and then we look at the characteristics of operations management within both manufacturing and service businesses. So both of those key knowledge points necessarily go together, so they'll all form part of this brief presentation, and then you can move more on to the research side of things. So here's just having a quick look at the key knowledge points as to where we've been and where we're going. So we've got those first 3 points covered after today, and that'll see us out for the week. And then once we've looked at the relationship between operations management and business objectives, the key elements of the operations system, and then the characteristics of operations management within both manufacturing and service businesses. We've done essentially the basics or the introduction into the particular course, and then you can see from next week we move into strategies to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the operations management system, so which take up the bulk of the course. So so introductory stuff for the first week, and then we get into strategies. So if we have a look at the elements of the operation system, obviously they're inputs, processes and outputs. So you'll be sick of hearing that by the end of the course, but they're the three. And the operation system refers to a series of procedures that we undertake, so processes in an organisation, in order to create its outputs of finished goods and services through a process that transforms inputs. So we have inputs coming into the system, through a number of processes, they transform into the outputs, which are the finished goods and services. So the processes part's a key element. So of the production process. Processes is how it's called within the study design, so you've got to get used to calling it that. It used to be called transformation, but better to think of it as transformation processes. So there are things that are happening within an organisation to turn our inputs into outputs. And I say it's important because often these processes are what's protected by copyright and trademark within an organisation. I've got a picture of the Big Mac bun then there. Obviously, Big Mac's or McDonald's special sauce is trademarked, and there are patents over it, etc. So that's all part of the processes of turning all of the ingredients into their output, being their burgers. So if we now have a look at the three elements individually, and the first one that we're going to look at is inputs. So they're the resources that are used by an organisation in the process of production, pretty obvious, and there are several of those which we'll go through now. Okay, so here's a list of inputs, not necessarily exhaustive, but different to other sources you may read. So I think in the textbook they quote five different categories of inputs. In Ed Rollo, I think they list 7, and I think I've listed 8 here. So it doesn't matter how many categories you list, just be aware of the different components that go into the production process. So in the ones that I've got here, you've got raw materials. So a baker, it could be flour. You've got component parts. So if you're a manufacturer of motor vehicles, there'll be different component parts which go into manufacturing the car. You've then got utilities, which could be your electricity and your gas and your rates, etc. Labour, so the employees that you hire to work in the factory there, it's all classified as inputs. Capital equipment within a factory, machines to manufacture, are all part of the input process. The factories that organisations work in, also part of the um, input category. You've then got your entrepreneurial resources. So the skills, the expertise of the owners of the business, that also is an input in an organisation. How things are produced, entrepreneurial resources. Then information and knowledge is very similar to entrepreneurial and resources. And then time, the amount of time it takes to produce certain goods is definitely, it's a cost of production. So it's an input going into the operations system. So they're just a few of them. I'm sure you probably come up with some more as well. Okay, the next element of the operations system is processes. So we've done the inputs. So the processes, the transforming of the inputs into outputs. So this is the key operations within the business. Think of them as verbs, as in doing words. So they end in ing. So just think of it that way, and then that helps for you to provide an understanding of what the actual processes are. And what happens is in the operation system is that a manufacturer will transform inputs into tangible products. So what they're doing, they're producing something at the end that you can touch, you can feel. That's what tangible means. So that's what a manufacturer does. And then a service organization, they transform the inputs into an intangible service. So think of the Uber ride. You sit in the taxi, which is fine, you can touch the taxi, but the actual service itself is intangible. Or going to an airline, to a flight centre when they're open and booking a holiday, getting their service and their advice is intangible. Going to the doctor and getting some inspection from the doctor, being checked over from the doctor is an intangible service. So a service is different to a manufacturing organisation. The manufacturer produces that tangible product. Service organisation transforms inputs into an intangible service. So they're one of the characteristics, and we'll go through a few more shortly. So as I said just a moment ago, think of the verbs and the doing words for transforming the inputs, the processes. So looking at doing something to the inputs to produce a finished good or service. So we've got there mixing, checking, packing, baking. They're all things, they're all processes, a way of transforming those inputs into the outputs. So that's the process part of the operations system where the items are transformed into the final output. And now we go to the outputs in the operation system. So we're looking at the final product or result of the operation system. So the output's divided into two categories of good and service. So tangible, those who've said, goods, when a good is sold, an object actually changes hands, or intangible, which is the service. When a service is sold, it normally involves the sale of labour. If you think of any of those services which are intangible, it is the person selling labour, such as the doctor, um, which makes it an intangible service. There's nothing physically transferred apart from the expertise of the person that you purchase the service from. Okay, so now moving on to the characteristic side of things, which is the difference between the goods and services. This is a good table which you can get to know. Again, you don't need to know everything on the table, but make sure you know two or three different things other than tangible, intangible. Everyone seems to get tangible, intangible, but you need to know some of the other elements as well. If you were asked a question and you needed to discuss in depth, you'd need to know a couple more points. So first of all, we've got our goods, which are tangible on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we've got intangible services. So we've got quality levels are therefore more difficult to measure on the services side when you're talking about intangibles and the sale of labour. It's difficult to measure the service that's provided. Under goods, so we're looking at manufacturing of goods. Production and consumption occurs separately. So for example, Coca-Cola when it manufactures a soft drink in the plant, it doesn't at that particular time have the consumer drinking the soft drink as soon as it comes off the production plant. It goes to a distributor, goes to a retailer, and then ends up in the shop, and the consumer buys the drink from the shop. So that's something that's unique to goods. Production and consumption occurs separately. The other thing about goods, when Coca-Cola again manufactures its bottles of Coke, they can be stored as inventory. So they don't have to be, because they're not consumed immediately, they have to be stored, they have to be shipped, and then they have to go through the distribution network to eventually end up in the retailer store who sells. So to do that, there needs to be the ability to store as inventory. That's um, another characteristic of goods. Another one is that they can be standardized. So which is consistent quality. We've got their example Mars bars, cars and clothing. Let's look at Mars bars. You can't have a customer of a Mars bar coming along to the manufacturer and saying they want a 1 kilo Mars bar and having one manufactured specifically for their tastes and wants. They're standardized. So to lower the cost of production, there's a standard unit of production, standard size of production, and a standard print run or production run that needs to occur to get the cost of production down sufficiently so Mars can make a profit when they sell. They can't have that interrupted by adjusting the standardized unit because a customer wants a different size Mars bar. So it tends to be standardized, consistent quality. That's another of the characteristics of a manufactured good. There's also minimal customer contact. So that customer wanted to come in and get his 1 kilo Mars bar, it would not happen. The manufacturer deals with the wholesaler and distributor, not generally with the final consumer. There are differences for that when you've got bespoke type of organisations like, for example, Rolls-Royce, who produce a very high quality vehicle. They'll have the end customer coming in and liaising with them to make final changes before they produce. But when you're talking about mass production of consumer goods, there's minimal or if little customer contact in the production process. The customer deals with the retailer long after the good has actually left the factory. And then finally, we've got under goods. Goods are produced, so that is the key. So you produce a good, you have the inputs, you then have you turn them into a final product. You produce that final product. So you've got the water and the sugar in with Coca-Cola being produced into a final drink. So that's manufactured goods. They are produced. Right, let's have a look at services here. So we know the first one, intangible, being the service rather than tangible, tends to be a sale of labour rather than an exchange of goods. So a service is intangible. On the next point down, production and consumption often occurs concurrently, simultaneously. So you've got there a patient goes to a doctor. The service is the doctor providing the service. The doctor can't provide the service unless the customer, being the patient, is there. So that's one example of that. The other example is the travel agent. The travel agent can't provide you advice on your holiday if you're not there to receive the advice. So the service is providing the travel agent providing the holiday advice and finding different holidays for you. So that's as that service occurs, the person who is purchasing the service has to be there to receive the service. So that's one thing that is different between the characteristics of a production organisation and from a service organisation. We then look to the third line and we've got difficult to store. Services are difficult to store. However, records of service is maintained, example, medical history, x-rays, legal advice. So they tend to be remnants of the service and they're not the actual service themselves. They're just a record of the service occurring. So under services, if you say they're difficult to store, you are 100% correct. However, records of service often are stored for use again in the future by particular professionals like doctors, so they can provide another service in the future based on past services. So difficult to store for services. Often specifically provided, tailored to meet individual client customer requirements. So again, tax advice. Uh, Me wanting to go to Tahiti on my holidays, it's specific advice. The doctor, you've gone to the doctor because you've got a boil rather than having a sore elbow. It's specific advice based on what you've gone to the doctor for. So that is so services are highly specified, whereas again the goods are standardised. So that's one very different thing there. And then finally, under service, obviously there's a higher degree of customer contact established. Most of the time, the production and consumption's occurring at the same time. If consumption's occurring at the same time, the customer needs to be there when the service is being completed. So there's that high degree of customer contact being occurring during the performance of a service. And then finally, as we said, the services are performed. So because it's a sale of labour, it's a person selling or performing a particular service um, as part of the production process. Again, going back to the goods and the production of goods, there's no tangible good to exchange. It's purely the exchange of labour. So I hope that makes sense in relation to characteristics. Okay, there's an excellent slide from Ed Rollo, which I'm going to put up now, which you really should get your head around, have a look at, understand what it's trying to say, because it does get covered a fair bit in exams by VCAR as we go down the track. Okay, so here we go. Here's similarities and differences between manufacturing and services businesses. And what we've got the red circle and the green circle. They're essentially what we've covered on our previous slides. So we've got the manufacturing organisation being the red circle, being tangible, production and consumption occur separately, can be easily stored, minimal customer contact, and mainly capital intensive production. That's another one I didn't have on my list. And then for services on the other side, you've got intangible. Production and consumption occurs simultaneously, difficult to store, high degree of customer contact, and mainly labour intensive production. So there are two. And it's very easy to, as we're going through and looking at the characteristics and then similarities and differences of manufacturing and services businesses, it's very easy to identify the points in the red circle and the green circle. We tend to have a bit of trouble with, and students had trouble with it last year, I think it was in last year's VCAR exam, is where the overlap is. So looking at the similarity, what do the organisations, manufacturing organisations and service organisations have in common? So what are the similarities? The differences are easy, but what are the similarities? I know they both run operations systems, so they both have inputs, they both have processes, they both have outputs, but what else is there? So I need you to focus on that both part in the middle, and you'll see that they both organisations, service businesses and manufacturing businesses, both use technology. They both deal with customers in a different sort of way, in a varying sort of ways. They definitely both deal with suppliers. They both aim to produce high quality output, whether it be a service or a product. They both aim to reduce costs of production so they can maximise their own profits, and they both aim to reduce waste. So they're points to be aware of as you're going forward, because you just never know when a question about the similarities of manufacturing and services businesses comes up. So as I said, something to ponder. VCAR love asking this question. It's just so make sure you can answer the similarities between service and manufacturing organisations and also the differences between service and manufacturing organisations. And we'll probably start on Monday with a question on that to try and get you to write a response to those particular questions. Okay, so that's just about enough from me. It's time for you to switch over to Edrolo and a couple of other exercises for you. It's important you watch Key Knowledge 2 and Key Knowledge 3 points. So get to Edrolo and make sure you're looking at the elements of an operations management system, and you're also looking at the characteristics. So you can also get a look at the questions that they're putting up and the worked answers for those. So that's important for you to work through those. Need to read the text, need to answer some questions. There's some on efficiency and effectiveness. Good time to start working on those. And then there's also some questions to ask on the elements of the operating system. So there's a bit to do there, but as I've said, there won't be any more content or any more theory for the rest of this week, so there's time enough to work through these questions. So that's it from me. Take a breather for the rest of the week. Get through the questions, do some revision. Make sure you're all up to date and you're comfortable with the elements of the operations system and the characteristics, etc., and tying them back to business objectives. If you've got those down pat, then you're going to have a great start for the rest of operations management for the rest of the term. All the best. Have a great weekend, and we'll catch up on Monday. Bye from now.